Oh, back. There we go. Okay, as Zarella said, this is Introduction to Serverless. And I mostly wanted this to be more like conversational, practical. I'm going to give like a brief overview of what it is, why, why you would use it, why wouldn't you use it. And then talk about some of the services that are associated with serverless development in AWS. You can do serverless in a lot of different cloud, like all the cloud platforms now, Azure and Google Cloud as well. But AWS is kind of the one that when you talk about serverless, that's the first one that comes to mind. So yeah, this is my kind of structure of the presentation and a table of contents, if you will. Basically what I just said, we're going to talk about why you might use serverless and what it is, and then talk about some of the services like Lambda and API Gateway, and then authentication and storage solutions, infrastructure as code, and then I'm going to wrap it up with like a list of resources that may be helpful to you if you want to learn more about it. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I think Zarel already did a really good job. I'm pretty bad at introducing myself, so I'll keep it pretty short. My name is Kyle. I'm a software engineer in the applied machine learning group at Paramount. So the team that I work on is called the Streaming Content Awareness team. And there's also the Capstan team. And the Capstan team, if you ever watch Paramount Plus or Netflix, they're responsible for the carousels that you see after you watch shows. It says, recommended for you, or, you know, 80s movies you might like if you watch a lot of 80s movies. And the Streaming Content Awareness team that I work on basically works on metadata and curation tools that feed those recommendations. And then I have a disclaimer here. I'm not an AWS certified expert, so this is going to be a pretty high level overview as someone that has worked with it in side projects. It was a little Avengers meme for y'all in there. So to get started, the first question you might ask is why serverless? And before I say why, I explain why you might want to use serverless. We can talk about what is serverless. First of all, it doesn't mean there's no servers. It just means there's no server management. So there's still servers in a data center somewhere. You just don't interact with them nearly as much as you would with a traditional setup. So yeah, instead of renting and managing a server yourself, they're provisioned as needed. It's highly scalable. And I guess caveat of that is you don't have access to the execution environment because of that. And we'll talk about why that might be bad in a future slide. Not bad, but a trade-off. The model is pay as you go. So it's instead of renting a server and paying for that server, even if nobody's interacting with it, you only pay if someone is making a request to your serverless function, Lambda or whatever, and that you're paying for that compute time. And so serverless is really ideal for short-lived tasks. And some examples are web APIs, batch jobs, and real-time data processing. And then lastly, serverless is event-driven. So all serverless functions are driven by events. And an event can be anything from an HTTP request, which we'll look at in a little bit, to a file upload or a database change, or they can even be timer-based, kind of like a cron job, just like every day, every month or whatever, do this task. So the next question is why serverless? I really like this tweet by this guy, Adam.dev. He says software startups should be built on AWS serverless by default. A few exceptions. Everyone thinks they're the exception. And that's kind of a hot take. But I think the reason for that is because you can focus more on your product and less on your infrastructure, especially if you're not a DevOps person. DevOps is like a full-time job. So that takes away a lot of your attention to the actual product that you're building. It can be more cost effective if you fall under one of those categories of those kind of short-lived tasks or web APIs, web front ends. And it's ideal if you have unpredictable traffic because you're only paying for that traffic that you're actually getting. You're not paying for just that, idle server time. You might have a huge spike because you had some sort of event or giveaway or something, and a bunch of people came to your site, and you only have to pay for that, that spike instead of having to pay for like an extra large server for, months. And so with talking about why you might use serverless, you also need to talk about why you might not use serverless because there's a lot of reasons you might not. It might not always be the right decision for you. I wouldn't use it for long running intensive data processing. Just rent a server. That's kind of what I was saying. Like if you have, a server that you're always constantly doing something on, then you're not really getting the benefits of, you know, benefiting from those like spikes in traffic and that auto scaling. You can kind of predict, how much compute time you're going to use up. Other reasons might be cold starts. So the way that these serverless functions and the servers behind them work is they kind of go dormant if you're not using them, and then as soon as you use them, they spin up, and that spin up time is called a cold start. So if you're working on something that needs like super snappy response time, serverless might not be the best option for you. And like I mentioned earlier, you have less control of the environment. So for example, AWS Lambda only offers support for like certain programming languages, certain versions of those programming languages. So like if Node 20 came out and you want to use Node 20, AWS Lambda might be stuck on Node 18, so you don't have as much control over that kind of thing. There's also this interesting article, and y'all will get the presentation after this. So I left a bunch of links in here you can kind of deep dive and learn more about. But there's a really interesting article about Amazon Prime talking about how Amazon Prime is expensive, or Amazon AWS is expensive. But I watched some videos, and people kind of frame this as like, oh, serverless is expensive. We save so much money by moving away from a serverless microservice architecture. But if you actually read the article and I watched some commentary on it, you can make an argument that their system was kind of poorly designed in the first place. They basically had like all their video streams from Amazon Prime, and they were splitting them up into individual image frames, and then storing them in S3, which if you all have ever worked with S3 or storage in the cloud in general, that's really expensive. So talk about like thousands of movies and TV shows, and they were storing like individual movies and shows from their service in S3 and pulling them out. So I think that was more the problem than serverless. But yeah, it's a good read. To get into the meat and potatoes of serverless on AWS, I think most people start with Lambda and API Gateway. They're kind of the two essential services you'll run into when you're building a web API using serverless. Lambda is kind of the foundation. You'll hear about Lambda and Google Cloud Functions, Azure Functions as FAAS or Functions as a Service. This is kind of the bedrock, the foundation of serverless in general, just functions. And it encompasses all those attributes that I talked about earlier. So pay-as-you-go, no server management, event-driven. Those are all attributes of AWS Lambda. And kind of like I mentioned earlier, they support many different languages, Node.js, Python, Java. I was working with C#, serverless C#. But again, like they might not support a version that you need. And they actually have a really good FAQ on their Lambda page that I thought I would share a link to. It was kind of hidden away from their docs. But just like tons of questions, any question you can imagine. So if you ask me questions at the end of this presentation, we're going here. No. So that's Lambda, and I'll show a demo here in a second of the actual AWS console and how you might create a Lambda and use a Lambda. And then the second service is API Gateway, and that's how you actually manage your API endpoints. So if you have a Lambda function, it's basically just a snippet of code. You have no way of calling that piece of code. API Gateway is how you would call that Lambda function via a HTTP request or web API. And it'll probably be easier if I just kind of show an example later. But like I said, you can create and manage API endpoints, get requests, post requests. You can specify the slugs. You could also hook it up to, I think it's Route 53 is like AWS. You can add your own custom domain to it. It also handles authentication and authorization. And one thing that's interesting is you can create a proxy route, which I think I might show you when I get into the demo. But instead of creating like individual routes and having individual functions for each of those routes, you could have one big function if you've ever used a web framework like Express.js or Spring Boot, if you use Java, um, uh, .NET Core, you can create a proxy route, and that basically just says once you hit AWS Lambda or API Gateway, just forward those actual requests to the router of that web framework. So it would go to Express, it would go to .NET Core, and after working with like individual functions, I think that might be a simpler way to go about it. There might be some like trade-offs as far as like performance. Yeah, demo time. So this is not a very impressive demo. I was working on a simple leaderboard service like you might have in a video game. You're playing a game, you get a high score, and then maybe like the game server sends it up to an external database. That might be, depending on the traffic a video game gets, that might be like a good solution for or a good application of serverless. If you're like Modern Warfare 2, it might not be a good idea because you have so much traffic. I'll log into the console. Oh no, 2 L's. Cool. So if you've never used AWS before, the console can be really intimidating. And that's why, actually, I'll talk about it a little bit later. There's a whole suite of products that their whole, or startups that their whole product is just nicer wrapper around AWS. And they just call it AWS services under the hood. It's gotten a lot better since last time I used it. Actually, it looks a little bit nicer. It's easier to find things. You basically just can search for whatever service, DynamoDB, which we'll talk about later, API Gateway, and then just click whatever pops up. So I have a few Lambdas here that I've already created. I'll talk about the create one first. So this is get out of my way. This is a Node.js 18 Lambda function. And to create a function, it's as easy as just clicking create function. You can specify your function name. They have some rules, I think. Only letters, numbers, hyphens. It's kind of like a variable name if you've programmed before. And then your runtime. So these are all the runtimes that are supported. Ruby, Python. They're actually pretty recent. I think Node 18 is like the latest long-term support version of Node. And I think Ruby 3 is pretty new too. I'm not sure about the other ones. You select your architecture, and that's it. You can click create. But I'll go ahead and look at one that I've already created. And in the code section, you can actually, if you create a Node one at least, they'll give you an editor where you can actually you can just write JavaScript or Node.js code in the editor. If you want to use like external packages and stuff, it's easier to just create your own environment, which I've actually done with the leaderboard service. And so I have a bunch of imports here. This library is called MIDI, which if you're looking to create serverless APIs in Node, I would definitely take a look at. It's a really nice like middleware engine. It basically, when you get a request from a Lambda function in AWS, it gives you the body as just like a raw string. So if you're saying JSON or whatever kind of data you're sending, Lambda has like no comp set of this, at least if you specify it as like a proxy. And so what MIDI can do is you can actually specify, hey, use JSON body parser. Like I know the body is supposed to be JSON, parse as JSON. And if it isn't JSON, it'll actually throw an error for you. And if you're using TypeScript, you can also use a validator. Actually, even if you aren't using TypeScript, you can validate the body. So for instance, what I'm looking for when you create a record in the leaderboard is I want a username and a score. There's also a achieved at date, but that's automatically generated on the server. It's just whenever I receive it. And user ID, which is also generated on the server, is just a UUID. And so you can say, hey, validate that this request that I get from the Lambda function, or the request that's sent to the Lambda function follows that schema. Like it has a username, it has a score. If it doesn't, it'll send a 400, which is a bad request. Um, uh, and then I'm using TypeScript, so the build process is a little bit more complicated. I have to compile it. You also need to copy your node modules because Lambda has no like concept of package.json. It just like it won't install node modules for you, create node modules for you. And then you just have to zip that up. If you're not using the like inline editor that shows up here, you can see here it says like my package is too large to inline edit it. And then you just upload it as a zip. And then you can, yeah, sorry. I also had like a sinus infection this past week. So like, I don't know if I'm being loud or quiet or what, like my ears are still a little weird. Um, so once you've uploaded your zip of your code, you can also test it uh, right here in the AWS console. So theoretically, if I test this, since I'm getting keys that I don't care about, like I'm not getting a username and I'm not getting a score, I should get a 400 bad request here. Okay, it's saying undefined for some reason. Okay, scratch that. You can test your Lambda function here. Um, and you can specify the body that you're actually giving it. It might be because I need to send it as body, not JSON. Cool. Okay. I had to, there's a body property that's required on the event that gets sent to Lambda, and I didn't have that, so it was kind of blowing up, didn't know what to do. Now that I have that body property, it's saying you don't have a username, you don't have a score. So it's actually properly validating. Yeah, there's also a CloudWatch integration by default with Lambdas that you create. So CloudWatch and AWS is just their like logging system. And so I can go to CloudWatch. And it'll create log groups for you for those individual Lambda functions. So here's my leaderboard create Lambda function. And I can go into the logs, and if there was any error, I can get more detailed information right here about the logs. Or I could build another Lambda function that parses, does something with these logs, or hook it up to like an observability tool that says, hey, your Lambda is like messing up for this reason. So that's really nice. So you just get that by default with Lambdas. And then, so once you have your Lambda, if you want to build a web API around it, like I said, Lambdas can be triggered by, if you want to insert something in a database, they can be time-based. But if you want to build a web API around your Lambda, you need to create an API. And so that's what API Gateway is for. So I've already created one here. And so an API in AWS API Gateway is kind of the overarching API, and then you have methods within that and resources. So the resource here in this case is /leaderboard. I always have trouble finding the actual URL. I think I have it in Postman. So when you create an API gateway, it'll give you this really ugly URL, which, like I said, you can add a custom domain to it eventually. But you can see the resource that I've created here. And if you go into it and click on the post option, you can see that I have actually integrated the leaderboard create function with this API. So now when I call this API via Postman, which I don't need that. Oh. Kind of like I was doing in the console. I get that error that it failed the validation because I don't have the username and score. And now I have this publicly accessible API that I can call from a front end application if I wanted to build a front end around this leaderboard, which I actually did, which I'll show here in a second. After I talk about the DynamoDB stuff. But that's kind of a very quick introduction to Lambda and API Gateway. Do you guys have any questions, things you want to like get deeper into while I'm here? Yeah.
Right. So provide a diagram of the server versus serverless architecture.
I have actually at the end of this presentation. But we can skip that real quick. It might be more helpful to see it right now. So I don't have one of like server full, but here's serverless. So this is kind of the big picture. I'll move this guy out of the way. Yeah. Is that better? Good, cool. Yeah. So the parts that I've showed you right now, I haven't showed you the application. So this would be like your interface. I haven't showed you authorization, which I'll talk about in a second. And I actually didn't add authorization to this project. I added to another project, but it's the same principle. And so we built the Lambda function, and we'll talk about that's DynamoDB. We'll talk about that in a second too. This is why I put this at the end of the presentation. But so right now we built the function, which is that Node.js script that I showed, which is able to receive some kind of request data or event, as they call it. And in this case, it comes from our REST API, which is built in API Gateway. And this is like a really dumbed down architecture. If you look at that Amazon article I shared, they have like step functions that process like those video streams and stuff like that. And it might not all be like HTTP based. So that'd be a more complex diagram you can look at. But this is the part that we've covered so far. So the REST API basically sits on top of your Lambda. I could even create, I could add another trigger for that Lambda too if I wanted. Like if I had a game in Unity or something, maybe I could add like an event after the game is completed I could make a post request through the web, or maybe there's some other like an SDK or something I could trigger some kind of event to trigger that Lambda to create that leaderboard record. Yeah, that's a very quick overview of Lambda and API Gateway. Trying to remember if there's anything that I forgot. Oh, let me show you. If you want to create that catch-all proxy route for like a web framework like Express, like I was talking about, I could try to show you that. So you can also create WebSocket APIs or HTTP APIs. HTTP and REST are, I think, kind of the same thing, just a little bit stricter about like the methods that you use and resources. The leaderboard one is a REST API. Sorry. Let's see. I think it's maybe when you create. Yeah. Okay. So you create proxy resource when you create a resource. So in my example, the slash leaderboard was the resource. That's just a REST API term. It just means the end of a URL, like basically. So like this is my domain name, my URI. And then technically this is part of the resource too. This is API Gateway has the concept of environments too. So if you're working on a team, you could have a dev environment, a staging environment, a production environment. And so in this case, I just have a dev environment because I'm not showing this to anybody but you guys. And then the slash leaderboard is that resource. So if you want to proxy those requests and not create like individual resources and methods and stuff, you can just create a proxy resource and just set it to that root path. And then when you're running an Express.NET Core or whatever web framework, your web framework will receive that initial request and it'll redirect and say, you know, go to slash leaderboard and it's a post request. So yeah, that's how you do that. Cool. Okay, so if you're building web API or building with serverless, you'll probably at some point want to integrate authentication and storage. And Amazon has solutions for that as well. For authentication, there's a service called Cognito. It's if you've ever used Firebase Auth or Auth0 or Okta at work, it works a similar way, which I'll also show you. It integrates really nicely with Lambda and API Gateway. I don't have an example of that. I can kind of show you where you go to set that up. And there's actually a really nice JavaScript SDK for the web if you're building a single page application or if you're building, and I actually have done both. I'm going to show you this one though. Get this guy out of here. There's just like a plain JavaScript SDK, and then there's also a Auth.js provider for using Next.js or SvelteKit or any of those newer modern front-end frameworks. It also supports user groups, which I'll show you with the example that I have. Actually, I'll go ahead and show you now since it's not related to the other project. All right, get out of my way. So like I said, just if you just come up here and search for whatever service you're looking for, it's pretty easy to find. So if I search for Cognito, I should have one user pool. I was building like a dummy hotel booking application, and it had the concept of talking about groups earlier. It had a concept of like admins versus hotel managers. And so I was able to create two separate groups and add these individual users to those groups. So one of them is an admin, one of them is a hotel manager. And I have a front end application that I can run real quick. This is that Next.js project. So this uses that Auth.js library that I was talking about. And what Auth.js does is it just integrates with a lot of different OAuth providers. So like you can log in with GitHub or Google or Facebook, and Cognito is just one of those providers. And so if you follow the docs, it's actually super easy to set up in a framework like Next. Even a single page application with just their JavaScript SDK that I showed. And again, you all have this presentation, so you can click on all the links and take a look at everything. Even that was really simple to set up. But the result is once you have your application running, you can log in, you'll get a button like this. You can style this page too. And you can even add CSS to their page, I think, because it's like hosted. Like this is a URL that I created and like I'm hosting this on. And so you can change the CSS, I think even. If I log in with I think this is my hotel manager user. Oh, it's my admin user. So if I log in with my admin user, you can see I've got my email. You could even add like a username or a first name if you want to say, hey, Kyle, how's it going? And if I try to go into this admin route that I set up, it's really easy to block people now from going to that admin route. But in this case, I am an admin. So I should get access to that. If I log out and log back in with Cognito, I gotta do like a Cognito tab. It keeps I could clear my cookies too, but it's easier to just do it this way. If I log in with my hotel manager account, you'll get the rollback hotel manager. And now when I try to go to admin, I can't access it because I'm aware of that group now in my front end that was created through Cognito. So instead of setting up my own user database and creating roles and stuff like that, you can just do it all through AWS Cognito, which is really nice. I think this is like I'm sure they charge at some point for like a certain amount of users, but I think it's like pretty generous compared to like a lot of auth solutions are really expensive, especially like Auth0 and Okta. So yeah, it's a really great solution if you don't want to build auth yourself. I think you can even add support for like GitHub and other OAuth providers through Cognito. I'm not going to try to click around and figure out how to do that, but just something to be aware of. And you can see your users here. It actually, I didn't show it here because they're already verified. You can see that. It has built-in email verification. So when I first tried to sign up, it'll send an email or it'll give you a message that says you need to verify your email. And then you go to your email and you can verify your account. So you don't have to build any of this. This is all just for free. You can just build your UI wrapper around it. And more importantly, in the context of Lambdas, you can add it as an authorizer. And so if someone tries to access your Lambda without the right token based on like them being incognito, you can block them and not give them access to it. Unfortunately, I don't have an example of that, but cool. And then the other storage, a lot of this isn't technically like serverless if people talk about serverless, but they're very like serverless adjacent. If you're building serverless web applications, these are a lot of services that you'll run into or want to use. But you could also use like other services, like you don't have to use AWS for these. But it's nice to be aware of them. So S3 is their object storage. You can store files, images. You can even host single page applications through it. So if I built like an application like I just showed you, I could bundle it up and put it on S3 and then configure the routing to actually host like that single page application and just serve and that web application to actual users. And then DynamoDB, which I do have an example for, is a serverless NoSQL data storage. So if you're familiar with MongoDB or Redis, it's like that. It's built more with like auto scaling features in mind and scalability in mind by default than I would say MongoDB or Redis. Yeah, and like I said, it's similar to it's serverless, so similar to Lambda. There's no need to manage your database instances. It's basically just treated as, which I'll show you here in a second. It's basically treated as one huge database, and you create your individual tables. And then there's also serverless SQL solutions within AWS, which is interesting if you don't like NoSQL. And it's called Aurora Serverless. And there's options for, it's compatible with MySQL or Postgres. I don't have experience with it personally, but yeah, I know. I'm not honestly the biggest fan of NoSQL data storage. So if you're looking for a SQL option, that's there too. And it's serverless. You don't have to worry about those individual instances or scalability or anything like that. Just probably have to be more mindful of like the cost of it. And then, yeah, I'll show you a quick example of what DynamoDB looks like. So within the console, if you go to DynamoDB, you can see tables on the side. So I have a user table, which I think was to store like additional information in that hotel booking application about users that you can or don't want to store in Cognito. And then I have this leaderboard table. I think it's empty right now. If I go to items, this guy is really getting in the way. Yeah, okay. So I deleted all the records for it. But in this same application that I showed you earlier with the leaderboard Lambda function, it also has a really nice JavaScript SDK. And so all you have to do is import your DynamoDB client and your DynamoDB document client. And in this case, I'm issuing a put command. Put just means I'm putting something in the table. And so when I retrieve that record that someone sent me via that web API, I generate a user ID for it. I generate the date that it was achieved at, which is just the current date. You might want to send this on the server or on the client because like it could take a while to get to the server, and then technically like someone could be losing by, if this was a real game, to get real technical. You know, like let's say like I get this high score first, and then someone comes in and gets it like right before me, and he's got like worse internet, and now his score or the first guy has like worse internet. Now he's got the score that was achieved like later. So you probably want to do that on the client instead. But anyway, tangent over. You issue that put command is so you specify the table name, which you saw in that list. I had the user table and the leaderboard table. And then you just give it an item, and it's a NoSQL database, so it doesn't care what you put in it. And so I specify the user ID, the username, the score, and when it was achieved at. I send that command and I wait for it to finish sending, and then I return that record back to the user actually. So you could issue that in Postman. I also built like a small UI for it, which I can show you real quick. Also using Next.js. It's a great framework. Cool. So you can see right now, I have another endpoint, which is a separate Lambda function to get all the records. There's no records right now, just like I showed you in the console, so it's not getting anything. If I click add, I add my username and a score of 500, and I save that. Something kind of interesting happens because DynamoDB is built to be like highly scalable. It follows a model called eventual consistency, which means that when you insert something, you might not necessarily get it back because it has like multiple partitions of it, and it has to wait for all those partitions to be that record to be copied to all those partitions. So if you immediately go to that page, it looks like nothing happened, which is why I added this refresh button. And when you refresh, and now it's updated. It only takes like a probably less than a half second. It's just because I'm redirecting so fast in the browser, it doesn't have a chance to catch up. So like if I do that and then click, oh, that one actually, it didn't take any time at all. So yeah, that's DynamoDB. If you want to store data and you're building a serverless application, so a good option. Unless you don't like NoSQL databases, then you should maybe look into Aurora Serverless. Yeah.
Do you have any diagram about how is the authentication from the client side?
I have the code that I can actually put on GitHub and send to everybody after this. And if you have questions, you can feel free to message me. I'm on Slack. You can message me whenever. I'm on my phone like 8 hours a day. So I also have like this kind of bad diagram um, that shows like, authorization sitting in the middle of your application, your REST API. So in that hotel booking application, which is separate from the leaderboard, um, the application that I showed you would be here. You would log into it. If you weren't logged in, if you tried to make a request to the hotel manager API, and you didn't send like a Cognito token with it, you would get denied right here, so you wouldn't be able to make a request. And then over here, I have an example of like the code I was just showing you was the node Lambda function. So your Lambda function can interact with other AWS services. So in that case, I was interacting with DynamoDB. You can put images into S3 in your Lambda functions. The only thing you have to be aware of is you have to give it the correct permissions, like your Lambda function, which I'll show you in a second because I forgot about that. So if you go to your Lambdas, it has, if you go to configuration, it actually takes you right there to permissions. And then you click on this role. When you create a Lambda, if you don't give it a specific role, it'll create one for you within AWS. And by default, this role just has access to CloudWatch, the logging system that I was showing you. But you can actually add permissions to it. So you just click attach policies, and anything you can think of that you'd want to do in AWS is right here. You just have to be aware of that and give your Lambda that access. So I actually ran into this when I was building this. I imported the DynamoDB SDK, tried to put something to it, and was getting permission errors. It was because I had to add the DynamoDB access. In this case, I'm adding like full access because that's just a simple one that they have. Like if you search for DynamoDB, they don't give you a whole lot of options. It's basically read only, and then these execution rules, which provide it's basically just read access. And if you want to be able to insert anything, the quickest way is just like that full access role, which isn't a good idea because you don't really want your Lambda to be able to like delete tables and stuff necessarily. So you probably want to create like a more detailed policy within AWS. Yeah, after this presentation, I'll push that code up and y'all can take a look at it, ask me questions, and you'll have access to this whole presentation too. Yeah, and then that brings us back to that big picture diagram. So you'll notice very quickly as you're building things within the AWS console that it kind of sucks and it's not very fun, especially if you're working on a team. I can imagine multiple people uploading zip files to an AWS Lambda, and so that's where infrastructure as code comes in. I don't have an example of it, but I added a section here because it's really important. And a lot of people who build these serverless web applications aren't just like building, just plain Node.js projects that they have a really, kind of whack function to just like zip the result of it and upload it to like, this is bad, don't do this. So you'll probably want to use one of the available infrastructure as code tools. Like I mentioned, working through the AWS console is kind of a pain. If you work on a team, it's kind of impossible. There's no quality control, no version control. And it's also difficult to test and debug locally. The only way you can really test it, this guy, he just keeps getting in my way. The only way to test it is to basically upload that zip file to your Lambda function like I was showing, and run that test function or build an API around it and test that API after you've uploaded the zip file. So there's a lot of options when it comes to infrastructure as code tools, or scriptable pipelines in AWS. Serverless framework, if you just search serverless, this is going to pop up because they've got like the money domain, serverless.com. They were ahead of the curve. It's if you're building a Node.js project, you can actually write the config in JavaScript, TypeScript, which is really nice. If you're not, if you're using like Python, I think it's like YAML based. There's a lot of tutorials because it's one of the most popular. It's I don't think I put. Oh, there's templates for a lot of different languages. Like I said, you can do Python, JavaScript. There's also different providers, so you could even use serverless framework for like Azure or Google Cloud, which you can't with some of these other. Actually, I think all these other tools I'm about to show you. There are pricing changes that like are just coming out with V4. I think the version before this was V3. Now they're releasing V4. But they only apply if you make more than $2 million, which is a pretty big cap. So it'll take you a while to get there. And if you have $2 million, you can probably pay them a little bit of money for the tool that you use. A lot of people are kind of weird about it because it is like an open source tool. But I've been seeing that trend a lot more lately with like open source tools having like paid subscriptions or options. It's also kind of difficult to test locally, even with serverless framework. They do have like a serverless invoke command that you can run functions with. But there's also this, I added this GitHub repo here for a tool called Local Stack, which actually is like a full cloud simulator that you can run on your computer. A lot of people use that with serverless framework to test. There's also a cloud development kit, which is an Amazon only thing. They maintain it as completely open source. You can even provision traditional like EC2 instances with which are just like those servers that you rent out. I think with cloud development kit. And it's newer than serverless framework, but serverless framework is getting updated all the time. Like I just said, they're releasing V4, so that's not really a big issue. Also, it's Amazon, so they're going to keep their stuff up to date because like you can't interact with, they want you to interact with their product and spend money on them. So it is easier to test via the serverless application model, which is another tool that's kind of adjacent to CDK, but specifically for working with serverless applications. And you can even generate full projects with just SAM or SAM. And I added a link here for that for testing locally with CDK. Another thing that I don't think I mentioned, but the reason you want infrastructure as code too is because instead of going through the console and clicking like create Lambda, create DynamoDB table, create that, you want that to be like generated as code. Because it's more portable, you get that version control, like I mentioned. It's easier to edit things. So if you want to like remove a Lambda, you can it'll do that automatically instead of you having to go through the console and click it, especially if you're working on a whole team of people. So, and then the last one here, this is a little bit different. The last one here, that's kind of a infrastructure as code tool for AWS and serverless is a newer one called Serverless Stack. It's actually built on top of CDK. It has a really nice API, especially if you're doing like JavaScript projects and full stack projects like Next.js with SvelteKit. But I think you can even write just types like back in TypeScript, JavaScript as well. It's got a really great tutorial. I would go there just to read the tutorial. And they explain a lot about AWS and serverless in general. And you build like a full notes application, which is really cool. And it's their kind of mission when they were building this, I read, was that they wanted to be super easy to debug and test locally. And so they actually have like a full live Lambda environment, which I included a link to, where you can actually test and debug those Lambdas that you're creating super easily. They have a whole video on it. I was hoping they had a screenshot. Oh, and it looks like they even support more than just TypeScript. So yeah, this is a really good one. I follow like the developers on Twitter, and they're just like really smart people too. And then these aren't infrastructure as code, but they're super popular platforms, especially if you're building like front-end applications, Next.js, SvelteKit, Next, and that's for Cell and Netlify. They're those wrappers around AWS that I was talking about. It's super easy. I've used them at one of my past jobs actually. I've used Vercel. Yeah, so I would definitely look into those as well if you're building front-end applications, those kind of full stack front-end applications. Yeah, that's all for there. And then here's some of the additional resources that I had. This is the guide that I was talking about where you build that full notes application on SSD, which stands for serverless stack. The page serverless framework, which I also had on the other one. This is an interesting one. I was like learning Ruby recently, and there's a framework called Ruby on Jets, which is a Ruby framework for building serverless applications. Kind of in the spirit of like Sinatra or other like micro frameworks like that. So yeah, I didn't really dig too deep into it. I thought I'd include it though, just to show you that my presentation was very like JavaScript, TypeScript heavy, but there's, you can do this in any other languages. It's more about the principles of like what serverless is, why you might use it. Yeah. And then I have some tutorials and courses in here. Udemy has some really good ones on serverless applications. And then I have a couple free like YouTube tutorials or free code camp tutorial that was really good. If you're interested in CDK, which I want to play around more with, so I don't have to go through what I did building those little demos. And then Golang for in the same spirit as the Ruby one, just to have an example of what a different language looks like on Lambda and building a serverless API with it. And I really let go. So yeah, and then once you've kind of had a grasp with serverless frameworks and Lambdas and stuff like that, you can look into serverless containers, which kind of combine the best worlds of serverless and container-based development, like traditional container-based development. You have more control over the environment. It's honestly something that I haven't really dug too much into yet. But AWS has a whole service for it called Fargate. There's also, I think, like Google Cloud Functions support containers as well. And there's a cool tool called Knative that I learned about, which is an open source project for building like container-based serverless applications, and it's even like sponsored by Google, IBM, VMware. Yeah, so it's like native or serverless Kubernetes. So yeah, I think that is it. Feel free to email me. You can message me on Slack, email me. If you have any questions. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So it's not having a very good way, or you couldn't export your Lambda configuration, import Lambda. Have we solved that yet? Or
That's actually a good point. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. I've never thought about that, but that would be very helpful. I know they did update their UI a lot. A lot of it is kind of just like skin deep, like it's just like I don't know if they've actually added that ability.
the frameworks you're pointing out, we have a solution.
Yeah,
They had a way to import for API Gateway.
oh yeah. Yeah, it's really nice with like infrastructure as code because you're just defining it in a YAML file or a piece of code, and then you could just copy that to another project or use it in another project and spin up the same exact Lambda function.
API Gateway.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, with CDK you can spin up and serverless framework. You can spin up basically any resource, I think, on AWS. You can create like a S3 bucket, Lambda function, API. Actually, I think I even have an example still. I was playing around with serverless and C#. Let's see if I have it in here somewhere. Bear with me if you're like a C# person.
What are you looking for?
Where's like, actually, I think it was a different project. If you spin up I'm not gonna bother with that. But if you spin up like a C# AWS project through Visual Studio, and especially like the .NET Core project, the serverless project, they give you a config, and it gives you like a really nice example of like how you might build a uh, configuration for like automatically provisioning like all those resources in AWS. You can do the same thing with serverless framework. It's just all defined like a YAML file. Examples. Yeah, people use Terraform too. I wanted to find like just an example of what the YAML file looked like, but
Yeah. And
okay, here we go. So why? Oh, okay. So this is an example. It's kind of a bad example though. I was like, why is there nothing in here? It's because I think they're doing that like proxy resource thing that I was showing you because this is an Express API. So they're just saying like HTTP API star because they don't have to provision those individual APIs. They have a ton of examples in here though, of like for all the languages and like platforms they support. You can just come to github.com/serverless and look at all the examples. Uh, this one might be better. Okay, still basic, but it's like a hello world, and you can create a function. Yeah, then you give it events. So like I was saying, a Lambda is triggered by events. Um, and one of those types of events is an HTTP event, which you can configure through API Gateway. You give it a path, so they're just saying at the root path here, and then in the get method. And so when you deploy this, which I think in serverless is like as simple as just saying like SLS deploy when you have the CLI installed. It'll provision all those resources for you. It'll create the Lambda. It'll create the API through API Gateway. If you have like DynamoDB, you can do that all here too. And then once you have that API URL, you can just make a GET request to it, and it'll spit out hello world. Yeah, so that's kind of like the selling for the value of having a framework like that, because I'll show you my process. So I have this Node application, which I created from scratch. Serverless has like templates that like this that give you a head start. So I had to create all this from scratch. I had to install TypeScript, all the packages I was using. I created this script that compiles that TypeScript and outputs it to a build directory. It copies my node modules to the build directory, and then it zips up that build directory. So I can run, I can run npm run build. It'll zip everything up. The nice thing about the way that I set this up too is I can have multiple functions in one directory and just upload the same zip to different lambdas. It zips all that together, compiles the TypeScript. And then I go to my Lambda function code, and then I upload that zip file that I created in the same directory, which like, it seems kind of quick, but when you're making the smallest change and you're trying to test it and you have to like bundle it into a zip file and then upload it, and then, oh, I messed up, I gotta change something. Yeah, it gets really old real quick. So definitely like I think I put it on the slide too. I would definitely recommend learning like the console first if you're new to AWS, like I was. And then once you understand it, you'll have a better understanding of the like infrastructure as code tools like serverless and stuff. You'll know what you're creating and why. So yeah. Yeah.
So I'm more on the designer user side of things. So we're using strategy. And having some troubles with I'm always just needing WordPress blogs here. So I change it real quick. It seems scrappy that just certain things that doesn't jive well with it because I can't see what I'm doing nearly as well.
Yeah. You're using it as like a headless CMS.
Yeah. I didn't know if there was any kind. I'm sure there's no workaround around it, but I just wanted to know if there was a way that you tell your end users that like going serverless, if there's a way to update things quicker, that you could see things during dev time and then you're gonna spit it out, then it can be, in the
Yeah.
serverless state.
Yeah, I I don't know if serverless is really the answer to that. I feel like if anything, serverless is like a little bit slower because you deal with that cold start problem. And so that's why it's like really good for batch jobs and things that you can just kind of throw off, like data processing and stuff you can throw off that people aren't really waiting for. And then web applications are kind of like I said, if you have like really high traffic or it's like a live sports betting website and I need like the latest information and need to put a bet right now or something like that, that's probably not the best. It's probably not best to go with serverless in that case. Yeah, so serverless is probably like if you're looking for like speed, it might not be like the best option.
When you sign up, so quick.
Yeah,
Server. Once you put it on, it's great.
yeah,
It's just like trying to access it. Double check your stuff without having to. And again, I don't know if it's the right term, I'm sorry, but it's recompile or whatever.
Yeah.
Finally make it its own
yeah,
file. That's the part.
yeah. I think we use Strappy for a project at one of the companies I used to work for, but I didn't have experience with it from like the editing side. I was just consuming the API, building like a front end around it. So yeah, I can't speak to. I know it's like built on Node and Express. I'm not sure if there's ways to like speed it up, make it more snappy. Any other questions? Cool. And feel free to, mess around Slack, email me, whatever. I'm always around. All right. Bye, Zoom.